Good morning, everyone. We're going to do Daniel chapter 5 today for our Sunday school lesson. We know as a review that Daniel was captured by King Nebuchadnezzar, and King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to change Daniel to be like him. And we know that God anointed Daniel to give the king interpretation and the meaning. Interpretation and meaning is the same, but of his dream, telling him what his dream was and what the interpretation of his dream was. We know that on the first dream that he had, he dreamt about Metal Man is what I call him. Of course, that's not a biblical name at all, and I don't know where the picture is, but I guess you don't need to see it right now. But he told King Nebuchadnezzar that he was the head of gold, and King Nebuchadnezzar was so excited about that he was the head country. He was just totally thrilled about that. So he built a statue to himself out on a plain so that everyone could bow to it and worship this statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. And we know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would not do that, so they were thrown into the fiery furnace, and they came out with not even the smell of smoke on them, and King Nebuchadnezzar saw God in there with them. And we know that King Nebuchadnezzar came to know the Lord. He gave the Lord honor and glory. He was put out to pasture. He had a lot of things going on. So don't miss lessons 1 through 4 or you'll get lost. But it's not a difficult book at all to understand. So I wanted to kind of bring it to life this morning. We had a service this morning already early, been up for a long time getting things taken care of. So I'm in my Sunday school room right now taping this lesson because at my house it's kind of crazy. I have a lot of children there. My grandchildren are staying with us for a little while they're waiting for a home to get ready. So I can't find quiet at my house to do this lesson. So just forgive me if it's a little bit discombobulated. I don't have a table here. I'm just in my Sunday school room. But since the fiery furnace happened, it's been, King Nebuchadnezzar served like 43 years and then he died. So now King Nebuchadnezzar is dead. And a lot of other kings have been on the throne and then taken off and so forth and so on. Usually a lot of the kings are killed. They're murdered so that the next person can be the king. It's just a crazy way that they did that. When we study the book of Kings, it's very interesting to find out how all these kings lived and died and how short a lot of them's reign was. So let's just accelerate. We're going to learn about this guy named Nabonius. He was King Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law. He's married to his daughter. And Nabonius' mom was a high priestess, and she believed in the little g gods, and he was very interested in being with his mom and promoting the little g god. So he didn't have a lot of attention to give the kingdom. So his son, Belshazzar, not Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar was Daniel, okay? This is Belshazzar. Then the reason the B-E-L is in their name, that's after a pagan god. So they use those names a lot like that. So Belshazzar was his oldest son, and so he considered himself as the king instead of his dad. Even though Nabonius was really the king, Belshazzar took over and acted like a king. It was just there was a long line of history there. Now, what's going on here is the king is having a feast, okay? Belshazzar's having a feast. Here's a not real picture of Belshazzar, okay? And he's given a feast at his place in this hall. And so, if you remember back in chapter 1, when King Nebuchadnezzar kidnapped Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, he told his people to take the articles of the house of God and bring it to his little g god. So there were some articles, some goblets that they stole, and he wanted to put them in his little g god house. So God's goblets that came out of his house were there. It's believed that not one of them was the same and that they were all in gold and silver. And so he's having this party, and he tells his people, he has like over 1,000 people at this party. I mean, 50 people to 100 people is a big party. This is thousands of people that are there. Their wives are there, their concubines are there, which is usually not something that they did. Usually the women would have their party in a different room. But this was a drinking feast, and the women were there. I mean, it was a wild party to say the least. So he tells his people, he says, he gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels that his father Nebuchadnezzar, now when you read that, when he says Father Nebuchadnezzar, that's his grandfather, but that's just how they talked about each other that way. It was always their father, but he was actually his grandfather. And so they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of God, and they gave them to the king, his wives, and his concubines to drink out of. Now, why do you think they did that? Of course, they were taking these goblets, and because they knew they came out of the house of the Lord, and they were making fun. There was thousands of them, people there, and they were making fun of the Lord. Belshazzar probably saw these goblets before growing up in his father's grandfather's palace. He's probably seen them before. I remember my little grandson, KJ, he's 18 now, and he's in the military, and I had little goblets that he loved to play with. They had glass stems and the tops were green, and they were tiny, and they fit in his little hand when he was about 3 years old. And I used to let him play with them right there at the table. I'd let him pour water in them and pour water out, and we learned how to be real careful with these goblets. When I read this story in the book of Daniel, it always makes me think of KJ and these goblets. So King Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, was enjoying mocking God just by using his vessels. He was just being, and he says they drank wine and praised the gods of their gold and silver, bronze and wood and stone. They were using the holy vessels to toast their little g gods, and it was not a good thing. So I wanted to give you, as a side note, the archaeologists, they found a large hall in Babylon when they were digging, excavated, I guess you'd say. In Babylon, it was 55 feet wide, which is pretty wide, and 165 feet long. It had plastered walls. It's unusual. It is believed that this is the actual room. Now, this is not a real picture, but it's kind of a cartoonish real picture of what this hall would look like. It was a big hall. And the archaeologists actually found it. And like I said, the walls were plastered. So he says, so you got to visualize it. I want you to be there. So at the same time they're having this party, here's my metal man. Sorry, y'all, I'm in my classroom and I don't have a table, so things are just kind of here beside me. So in the same hour, now they're partying, they're using the golden vessels, they're actually mocking God by doing that. He sees, it says, the same hour the fingers of a man's hand appeared, wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. Now here the word plaster is being brought up again. And when the archaeologists found this hall in Babylon, it was plastered walls. And he sees this hand. He sees this finger writing opposite the lamp. So what that's telling us is it's God. I know that, and I'm not discrediting that in any way, shape, or form, but it is saying that there was a lampstand there, so it cast this shadow of this hand that they could see, and it was writing on the wall. And so King what's his name, Belshazzar, not Belteshazzar, he's all top dog at this party, and then all of a sudden he's drinking, he's mocking God, and all of a sudden he sees this hand writing on the wall. Have you ever heard your grandma or your mom or someone say that we'll see the writing on the wall? Well, that's what this is talking about. That's what people are talking about when they say that. They're taking it from the Bible. So it says the king, like I said, he's all merry and he's all there. He's showing off for the women and everything. It says his countenance changed all of a sudden. His thoughts troubled him. He became troubled, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. He became so scared that his knees literally knocked together. That's pretty scared. He was scared. So he's at this party. He sees this hand. He's drunk. He's probably got women hanging all over him, and he becomes frightened. He becomes pale. He couldn't get control of his thoughts, and his knees were actually knocked together. It said that his hips became loose. So he's physically and mentally scared to death when he sees this. He should have been glad he was drunk, when this happened, or the fright itself might have killed him. So it goes on to say, the king cried aloud, here we go again, just like King Nebuchadnezzar. He starts crying aloud to get the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. He wants them to come, and he says, whoever reads the writing on this wall and tells me the interpretation of this writing, I'm going to clothe them in purple and give him a gold chain, and he shall be third ruler in the kingdom. All right, so his dad Nabonius, and then him Belshazzar, and then whoever does this is going to be the third leader. All right, and he says, and now all the king's wise men came. He said, but they couldn't read. The Bible says they couldn't read the writing on the wall or make known its interpretation. There's writing on the wall, and they call these soothsayers again, these false people. So they were just of no use to him whatsoever. And the reward, he said he would give them, I'm just kind of picture happy today. He said, you'll be the winner. You'll get this gold chain, and you're going to be the winner if you can tell me this. They'll be clothed with purple and have a gold chain around their neck and be third in the kingdom. So, we know back in John and Genesis, every time wearing purple always meant royalty. There's a whole lesson in that too about heavenly colors. But purple was a color of royalty. It represented that. So the gold chain would represent kingship, and the purple robe would represent royalty. So we know Belshazzar is not really the king, but he's making all these decisions. So you got to think about what you think the party atmosphere would be at this point after everything that they were doing, and then all of a sudden the king is just done. He's just done. He's greatly troubled. And so what happens is nobody can interpret this writing on the wall. Nobody can interpret it. So not the people he called in. So what happens is the queen, because of the words of the king of the lords, came to the banquet hall. Now, if she came to the banquet hall, that means that she wasn't there prior. She came to the banquet hall. She must have heard everything going on. And she said, "O king, live forever." She said, "Don't let your thoughts trouble you, nor your countenance change." So here's the queen. Like I said, today I'm picture happy for some reason. So the queen comes in and she tells him, listen, chill out. She says, there is a man in your kingdom whom the spirit of the holy God is with in the days of your father, meaning his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. And she says, he has light and understanding and wisdom. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, made him the chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans. She said, call this man Daniel. I don't read every verse for the sake of time. You read every verse. But she comes down and she says, call this man Daniel. She was a grandmother. She was probably King Nebuchadnezzar's wife because she knew about Daniel. And Daniel's 80 years old at this time. So she said, now let Daniel be called and he will give the interpretation. So this is what she tells him to do. Thank God for grandmothers, right? The way she spoke to him, the way she soothed him, everything she did, she tried to make him feel better, even though he was not a good guy. Grandmothers do that. She tried to make him feel better. So she said, now let Daniel be called. And so she had seen probably in her lifetime some of the things Daniel had done. So then Daniel was brought before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you the Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, who my father the king brought from Judah? So the first thing he says to me is a little bit demeaning. Are you one of those people that my grandfather kidnapped? Like, you're really not all that important, but are you one of them? He says, but I have heard that the Spirit of God is in you. The Spirit of God is in you, and the light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. So we wonder why Daniel wasn't there, why he didn't show up earlier. He wasn't at that party. He wouldn't be drinking out of the goblets just for fun and mocking God. He wasn't there, but he was brought in. Some believe Daniel had been left alone. He was old. And this new generation of folks that were coming in, Daniel just probably didn't have a lot to do with these folks at this time. So then he says, Daniel says, that was seeming, I already said that to you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought before me, and that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not give interpretation of this thing. He's explaining this to Daniel. And he says, and I have heard you that you can give the interpretation. Now, if you can read this writing on the wall and make me understand what it means and give me the interpretation, he says, you'll be clothed with purple and have a gold chain around your neck, and you shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. He again reiterates what he just told everyone. So Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself. I don't want them. I don't want that gold chain, and I don't want that purple robe. Just keep them for yourself. He said, I'll read the writing on the wall and I'll tell you what it means. So Daniel proceeds, and he says, O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. He's telling him that, your grandfather had all this. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all the peoples, the nations, and the languages trembled and feared before him. Remember, he was the head guy. He was the head of gold. And he had so much pull with everyone. He was the top guy. And so Daniel's explaining that to him. He says, because he was over so many nations and peoples and languages, people feared him. He executed whoever he wanted to execute. He kept alive whoever he wanted to keep alive. He did what he wanted to do. So Daniel just explains how his grandfather was, even though I'm sure Belshazzar knew that. But he said, when his heart was lifted up and his spirit hardened with pride, he was disposed from the kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And Daniel's explaining that King Nebuchadnezzar was sent out in the woods for 7 years to be like an animal so that he could come to know the Lord. We went through that study, our last study, so get that if you didn't get it. So he's explaining that, King Nebuchadnezzar was not a good man and that he did all these terrible things, but he was sent out in the woods to come to know the Lord, and he did. And he says he was made like the beast. His dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He ate grass until he could find that the Most High God rules in his kingdom, not Nebuchadnezzar. He wasn't the king that he thought he was. The Lord above is the king. And so Daniel's explaining this to him. He says, but you, his son, meaning his grandson, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. And you have lifted yourself against the Lord of heaven. You're drinking out of these goblets. You're mocking God. And they brought the vessels of the house before you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drank wine from them. He's telling him off. And you have praised the gods, little g gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see nor hear or know. They're not even alive. And the God who holds your breath in his hand owns all your ways, and you have not glorified him. So the first thing Daniel does is tell him how his grandfather was, and he's telling him how he is. He's putting a hole in his balloon. He's popping that balloon for him. He says, you've lifted yourself up against the Lord. You've taken these holy vessels. You've done all these things. And he says, don't you get it? Are you crazy like your grandfather? Your grandfather got sent out for 7 years until he learned this. And you're doing the same thing. And so he says, the fingers of the hand were sent from him, meaning God. And this writing was written. And this is the interpretation. Mene, tekel, parson. Now this interpretation, it means, it's very simple. This is it. When you read your Bible, you'll see it. Okay? It says, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. You've been weighed and you're lacking, buddy. And he says, your kingdom has been divided. Remember, Babylon is the head of gold. He says, your kingdom has been divided. What that means is we're going to go to silver. The two arms, that's the division. Silver is lesser than the gold. And he says it's going to be divided. Your kingdom's now going to be divided. And if you can read here, Media Persia. Okay, that's the name of what's coming next. This was Babylon. Now Media Persia is going to be weaker than Babylon, but Babylon's been knocked out, and now it's going to be Media Persia, and it's a divided kingdom. So he's saying your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians, is what he's telling him. It all goes back to the string. You were head of gold. Now this mene, tekel, parson means you've been weighed in the balances, you've been found lacking, and your kingdom's going to be divided. That's all it means. And what he didn't know was that at that very moment, his kingdom was being divided. I'll explain that. So he says, you've been numbered, weighed and divided, and you're lacking. So then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with a purple robe, and they put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. I guess Daniel just let them do that because, he's older. He was done with all of this. He gave the interpretation of the dream, and he just let them do what they needed to do for their little ceremony. And it says that very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain. That very night he was killed. This party was 24 hours, y'all. This whole lesson that I just taught, I hope that you can even grasp anything from it, because all my stuff's falling off the chair here beside me and I'm moving around trying to hold everything together. But it was a 24-hour thing here. And so they honored Daniel, and Belshazzar is slain right then. And Darius the Mede, Darius is a man. Mede means, here's the Media Persians. Darius the Mede means he was from Medio, Persia. Darius is a man. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, and he was about 62 years old. All right? So stick with me. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of gold. He loved himself, and God set him straight. And now his grandson is taking over the kingdom, but he's been killed within 24 hours after he read the writing on the wall. And Darius the Mede from Media, Persia, has taken over. He's going to be a lesser kingdom. They're divided. And they say divided because it's the Medes and the Persians, and the two arms show a division. Okay? So Daniel, so he was killed. And Darius the Mede was 62 years old. Nebuchadnezzar had built a city that could withstand any siege. This is what I want to tell you what happened, how he was killed, because you're probably thinking, you're telling me he's killed, but I don't know how he was killed. Let me just explain this to you. I might just read it to you here. Nebuchadnezzar had built a city to withstand any siege. He had made walls around his city. The walls were 15 miles square, which means 15 miles long, all the way around. It was 300 feet high. That's high. So just imagine these walls. Can you hear the music? Church has started. And I'm in my Sunday school room, but we're done in just a minute. So he has this huge wall around his city, and it was constructed of brick. It could have had a freeway around the top of the city. 4 chariots could travel. It just had everything you could want. They could travel on top of the city. Now, there was a canal that came off the Euphrates River, which went right through the city. So Belshazzar was considered the city secure of any assault. It was considered secure, and it could sustain, it had enough supplies that could sustain everyone for 20 years. But what was going on was at the time of the banquet, unknown to Belshazzar and his party animals, who were engaged in much drinking and dancing and whatever, the Medes, they were under the walls of Babylon. There was normally waters from a canal flowing there. The Medes cut the water off and channeled it into the Euphrates River. And the next thing we know is Belshazzar's dead. So as he's having this party, and he's so secure in his city because he had the walls, he had everything, enough food for 20 years. He had everything that he needed. He had security, but he never suspected that someone would come under the walls and get him. And that's what happened. That was the writing on the wall. So he's been weighed, found lacking. The balances weren't good. He's going to be divided, and that's what happened. So now Darius the Mede is in charge, and we're going to continue this study. I really apologize if y'all just feel like this was discombobulated, but I'm trying. It's just been a crazy week. God bless y'all. Stay tuned for chapter 6.